Thank you so much for writing that wonderful piece about the murderer's row. And for those who haven't read it yet, which I hope they will in this issue, I wonder if you could just tell us what the murderer's row is.
Well, I think different people here might define the group a bit differently, but the comparisons obviously to the 1927 New York Yankees murderer's row lineup that had Ruth and Gehrig, et cetera. Well, we had sort of a scientific equivalent here when I arrived, and this was folks like B. Mintz, Al Knudsen, Barry Blumberg, Bob Perry, Ernie Rose. I mean, it was just an incredible lineup of people, and there were others too, but those were kind of the most famous of the group. Two of them, went on to win the Nobel Prize. All of them were in the National Academy, and arguably some of the other ones should have won the Nobel Prize too, like Al Knudsen and B. Mintz. Certainly, were close. So this was just a phenomenal group of scientists who really set the tone for this place, which arguably continues to this day. And so they were, people who hired me and sort of my class back in the 90s. They're all gone now. B. Mintz was the last of that group, but I think their impact is still quite deeply felt here, and not just in me, but in the entire institution.
And they used to sit in this one row and ask difficult questions, is the way you describe it.
Oh yeah. Going into a seminar, I mean, they're all nice people, don't get me wrong, but it was quite intimidating because you had this group who would sit there, and when they're going to ask you a question, you better have some response. And generally, those questions were not the typical ones, not technical things about, how did you do your Western blot? They were fundamental to your project, like, why are you even doing this? Because I think they all shared one property, which was most expressed by B. Mintz overtly, which they were not interested in small problems. They're only interested in big problems, because I think they all had the insight that we have a limited amount of time and energy in our research lives, and you can work hard on anything. So if you're going to work hard, it might as well be on something important, and that kind of drove their careers. One wanted to make sure they thought that you were working on something important too. So so it was a interesting group to present to.
Oh, I bet. So Fox Chase is the kind of place where Nobel laureates worked, and you have a museum, of course, on the second floor. Does this proud history provide a path forward now that you're in charge and charting?
Well, I mean, I think you would get a variety of opinions if you asked a lot of people here, but since you and I are on this talk, I'll give you my view. I think it very much does inform, what we're doing now. I mean, there's some very direct connections. I not only did most of the senior staff get hired by this group, but many of those folks came here before we were even an NCI Cancer Center, and we never had a departmental structure here, but what they all founded, all of those 5 members of the Murderers Row and others, founded things called working groups. Those working groups ended up morphing directly into the programs that are now part of the NCI Designated Cancer Center. So it was a very natural evolution. We didn't start with the department structure and try to split off sort of these cancer center programs like a typical cancer center would do at a university. They evolved directly from the working groups that we'd already established. I mean, for example, Al Knudsen, who's the one who hired me, had a working group that was called, I think, molecular oncology. It then changed to cancer biology. That program basically still exists. So that evolved out of his working group. And at that time, it was, tumor suppressors and oncogenes. That was kind of the themes. And arguably, even to this day, we don't necessarily call it or separate it out that way, but that's what we're still studying. Things like AKT that got discovered here, and the various other kinases that I work on and other people, and various tumor suppressor genes that are part of the program now. So that was a direct descendant. Epigenetic program came out of B. Mintz's work, which I think we discussed in in her obit in Cancer Letter a few months ago. The virology group, which was Barry Blumberg's thing, and then later Ann Skalka, our director before me, has also has its descendants now. Some of the virologists now are doing some of the best cancer work in the center, as they did back then. So it's interesting how, you know, the wheel just turns, but the topic matter is still largely the same.
How would you describe your current challenge? Fox Chase has a 1-year no-cost extension. How do you get back to where you were?
Yeah, that's you know, it's definitely a challenge. I was pretty clear-eyed about it when I accepted this job because I knew the challenge would be pretty steep. Nevertheless, I'm confident that we can meet the challenge. So, you know, what was the NCI upset about? They thought that we had very little institutional commitment from our parent, Temple. And it's easy to see how they came to that conclusion, in that, you know, we kind of shook the NCI twice, once by getting sold, you know, from being an independent freestanding center to Temple 10 years ago, and then the near sale and then aborted sale to Jefferson last year. And I think it's a hard story to understand in any way other than they did understand it, which was that Temple was trying to get rid of us. Now, there were reasons, and I think they actually had good intent. They felt at that time that they couldn't adequately capitalize, you know, a high-end cancer center such as this one, and that was the reason for the attempted sale. But then when it fell apart and they re-embraced us, I think the NCI was very skeptical about, you know, whether they really wanted us and whether they would adequately support us. I think they absolutely will. They have completely new leadership at Temple, new dean and a new head of the health system, which are very committed to Fox Chase in a most tangible way possible, which is to the tune of, you know, $75 to $100 million of, you know, hard investment, and a much more profitable system overall that can sustain that over time. So, you know, the biggest challenge, which was to, I think, convince NCI and the rest of the cancer world that, you know, we're back in the game with adequate support, I think will more than meet that. I'm quite confident about that. And there were a variety of other challenges as well. Those were more, I would say, routine, in that, you know, facilities, certain ones they didn't, core facilities that they didn't think were up to snuff. Well, we can fix that pretty easily. The science hadn't really suffered. That wasn't an issue, and it won't be an issue next time, I believe. So I think we're overall in pretty good shape, although, you know, we still have some hills to climb.
So it's a 1-year no cost extension. What's the next thing that happens that you have to do?
Well, actually, it's more likely a 2-year no cost extension from more recent conversations I've had with NCI. So we will remain as an NCI designated center in a no cost extension at least through mid 2023. The grant itself will go back in January of 2024. So there will only be a short period when we're kind of off the list, so to speak. You know, I'm pretty confident that we will then regain a full status once the new grant is reviewed. I'm in, you know, quite close contact with people at the NCI just about, they're very interested in us. They've let us know that. I think it's such an unusual case for them. Of the 50 cancer centers, you know, we're the only ones who have gone this particular route. And they have expressed directly saying we are interested in what happens here. And so I have been in contact with, you know, all the way to the now outgoing director to his direct, you know, seconds in discussing exactly what's going on here. And I check in with them quite frequently to let them know about our progress.
Yeah, when we talked in December, you mentioned that you had a detailed plan. Could I ask you to summarize it for how you're going to pull this off?
Sure. So I think, you know, the day that I took this job, which was, I think, the day before Thanksgiving in 2021, you know, I called a meeting the next day with our, you know, various program leaders and associate directors, et cetera. And I laid out kind of a 9-point plan of these are the things we got to do to get back in the game, to, you know, restore the core grant. And, you know, the first one was to establish the parameters of this institutional commitment that I discussed a couple of minutes ago. You know, how could we convince the NCI, and not by razzle dazzle, but by actual facts, that Temple had undergone, you know, a complete change, that the system was highly committed at Temple to supporting Fox Chase, because that was the chief complaint last time, if you will, if you want to think of it that way. And so that would be the most important thing that we would have to address in any renewal for the grant. And so that is the first thing. They had questions, or we expect they'll have questions about the whole leadership role here. So, one of the differences between my job now and my predecessors is we have intentionally split the role of Cancer Center Director from CEO. So you may know the freestanding cancer centers, as this one had been for so long, prior to my taking on this job, the Cancer Center Director was also CEO of the organization, head of the hospital, basically the head of everything here. That model worked when this place was smaller. So, Bob Young did a great job as kind of the leader of the entire enterprise. I think Michael Seiden, did what he could. It was getting more complicated. That's when we got sold to Temple, and Richard Fisher as well. When I was discussing with the head of the health system, how we would move forward, I told him I thought the job had gotten too big for any one person. This was not that I could come in and somehow fix all the things that might have gone wrong here, that we really needed two people, somebody to manage the hospital and the enterprise, and someone else to manage the science, clinical trials, and research portfolio. I was very comfortable in that second position. I think that's what a cancer center director should be doing. I really can't be involved with, whether the nurses are going to organize into a union, or whether, the RVU generation is right in the clinicians. And it's just, there's a lot of stuff. I mean, this organization has 2,500 or so employees, and it's a complex job to manage all that. So Rob Uzzo, who's he's still the head of the surgery department, has taken on the role of at least interim CEO, and he may end up being permanent. I don't know what will happen there, but he's taken on all of that administrative role for the hospital, where I've taken on the more traditional core grant related things. And so it's made this job just much more manageable. I can focus on what I think is what I should be focusing on for the cancer center, and not things that are important for healthcare, but are just out of my strike zone, so to speak. So that was number two, the leadership role. 3 was enhancing our grant funding, including getting more multi-PI grants. We have reasonable grant funding base now. We have some multi-PI grants, but not really as many as we ought to. That's kind of a long-standing issue here. I have plans on how we're going to go about doing that, that we can get into if you like, but that was sort of number 3. Clinical trials wasn't criticized so much last time, but our numbers are still suffering from the COVID era. Our accruals are not up to where they ought to be. And I'm spending a lot of my time trying to kind of recharge the whole clinical trial apparatus here, both getting more meaningful trials and getting more numbers of people into trials. We had to launch a DEI initiative. I may think it's not that we weren't interested in diversity in the past, but I think it's reached kind of a critical point for the NCI in general, for all the cancer centers, and for society too. We no longer can really go on like we were, just hiring without considering diversity, looking at our patient populations, who's entering clinical trials, et cetera, our own faculty. So to that end, we needed to get, first of all, an associate director in that space where we didn't have one. I was very fortunate there was an internal person here who was absolutely ideal for this position. I think you just announced her ascension to that role. That's Camille Reagan. We have a new DEI initiative. We need to do more in our community. So there's a CEO or community outreach engagement initiatives that we're working on. Fixing our core grant, our core facility deficiencies. I mentioned that there were a couple of our facilities that had gotten kind of out of date and were, reasonably criticized by the NCI reviewers. And so we're working on fixing that, and it helps that we have money to do that now. Commercialization of research is something that was never really focused on much here in the past. And then our education mission. So that was kind of the 9 things for us to do. Now they're all in themselves big enough to take pretty much all of my time. So I've had to learn to delegate a lot of these things to my very good and trusted associates here. It's part of the learning curve of being in this job, that you really can't do everything yourself, as one tends to do as running a laboratory.
Well, a lot of people are wishing you well on this. And you mentioned the institutional commitment as being about 75 million.
Yeah.
Is that over how long?
That's 3 years.
Yeah, should that do it? Should that be enough?
Oh, I think for the next 3 years, it's enough. I mean, it presents an interesting challenge of, how do you spend $75 million productively? It's a nice challenge to have, and it's a different one that I've ever had in my career. But we've kind of figured out how it's going to get spent. A lot, I mean, to make it very simplistic, it's people and stuff. The stuff is to modernize the various core facilities that have, gotten a little out of date. Genomics equipment is quite expensive. Imaging equipment is quite expensive. We had stuff, but they were, 10 years old. And these days, the half-life of that kind of machinery is not 10 years anymore. It's a few at best. So that's all getting upgraded. So that's sort of the stuff part of it. And then the people is where the major investment is. We're on a major recruiting drive for junior people and for more senior people. And it's a kind of drive that we've actually never had in the history of this place, as far as I know it, is certainly in my 30-year history here. We have never been kind of flush enough to do this kind of a drive. So my predecessors, when they got their package to be cancer center director, it was much more modest. And Fox Chase has always done a lot with a little. I think it's one of the charms of this institution that they've managed to do so well on relatively little resource. But that's a hard game to play year after year, and I think we suffered for it. I think at the moment we're in better financial condition than we've been in the history of this 100-year-old institution, and I intend to take full advantage of that. So we are going after talent wherever we find it in strategic areas, of course, but it won't, if we don't land people, it won't be for lack of resource. And that's a refreshing change.
I guess our readers would probably want to know what are you looking for?
Well, we did a big strategic planning event in last summer and identified a number of key areas that we thought we could make a difference in, because all cancer centers have great researchers and you can't do everything. So we wanted to leverage what we have, make it better, so it would be sort of a world-class effort in a few areas. So one of the big things that actually started when I was still scientific director here was trying to focus on cancer epigenetics. At the time we started this, it was a relatively new field without too many players in it. Now it's a red hot field, but I think we're red hot in it too. We recruited a guy named Jon Chernoff from Mass General, who's one of the up and coming players in the epigenetic space. He was given himself a relatively large package to recruit people, and he's done so very successfully, getting some junior folks, and has another recruiting drive right now. We created a new institute around him, a Cancer Epigenetics Institute. So that's not part of the formal core grant structure. It's not a program. It's a separate sort of center or institute within Fox Chase. But he has done some amazing things in terms of conferences and industry relations and now clinical trial activity. So he's really building, I think, a first-class scientific effort around cancer epigenetics. So we're going to continue to build there. Some of the other areas are a little more incipient. They're ideas we have that we're building, but they're not as well developed yet as John's program. So cancer and aging, another area that's become very hot now. It's not unrelated to epigenetics. Actually, epigenetics has a lot to do with it, but this is an area that we're trying to find a mid-level leader to basically seed that effort. We have some junior people working in that space, but to make it, a more cohesive, we want more of a mid-level person working there. I'm interested in drug resistance. It's sort of close to what I do. So, I came up in the signaling space, and like everyone else, I was blown away by the success of drugs like Gleevec, and then bitterly disappointed how rare examples were of that type of drug. I mean, most of them engender pretty quick resistance, and we're dealing with that to this day. So we're very interested in exploring how to identify roots of resistance and then how to overcome them. And so we have a fairly mature program there. We don't have an institute per se, but we have a initiative called the Cancer Kinome Initiative, which gets into these mechanisms of resistance to targeted agents. So that's a third one. And then, in the diversity area, one of the advantages that Temple brought to us when we, got together with them is they serve a larger and more diverse population than we do. I mean, they're located in Central Philly, as you know, And it's allowed us to gain access to a whole patient population that we really didn't have access to before. And I think that it's a two-way street. I think it benefits those patients because they now get access to first-class cancer care and the ability to get onto trials, which they might not have otherwise gone on to. For us, it improves our science because now we're not just restricted to a fairly undiverse background in Northeast Philly where we sit. So that's another area where we're trying to build quite a lot. And as I said, we started a new associate director position here, but it's not stopping with that hire. It's actually a lot deeper than that. There's many things we have to do to improve there. When we're said and done, it's probably going to be 25, 30. Which is a lot considering we only have about 80 labs here now. So we're talking about increasing the mass of people by a third. So it's kind of exhilarating to be in that position. Again, I've been here a long time, and I've seen various directors come and go, but nobody has ever had the advantages that I currently have. So it's kind of a strange thing to say after what we've been through, and the fact that, as you mentioned, we're in this no-cost extension. But the tools have been given to me to make this place right, and I absolutely intend to use them. They're not all financial tools, but they're very helpful. I mean, as I say, no money, no mission. It's not everything, but it's not nothing either, because without that, I just can't get the kind of people that I need to get here. And going back to the beginning, the tradition of excellence that we've always maintained here is the core value of Fox Chase, really, in science, is that whatever it is that you're studying, you better be good. We have a mixture of blue sky scientists like we've always had and people who do more applied work. And I'm fine with the entire spectrum of this, with the sole exception that the people need to be creative and good at what they do. And if they do that, I basically leave them alone and try to help them get funding if that's their issue or whatever obstacle they might have, but just unleash their creativity. And I think we can do that now in a more effective way than we ever had before. And, we're just getting a lot more support in other ways from Temple, Maine than we ever did before. I think in the beginning, it was a strange relationship. We had got a freestanding center together with a place that didn't ever have a center before. There was a lot of cultural clash. It wasn't through bad will, but it was just difficult for everybody to figure out how this new system is going to work. Well, we've had 10 years to kind of get it right now. And I think we're much more in sync with folks downtown and vice versa than we ever were before.
Mm-hmm. Well, correct me if I'm wrong. Sometime during COVID, you stopped being truly a freestanding cancer center and became part of a matrix. I mean, a more formal way or more functional way, rather.
Yeah, it's kind of, it should be a very straightforward question. What is this, a matrix center, a consortium, or freestanding, the three types? And we're really none of the above, because we formally, you'd think we'd be a matrix if we are part of this larger organization, and we have people from the downtown campuses run programs up here, and the chair of one of the departments down at Temple is actually a Fox Chase person. We still maintain separate payrolls, so that's a little different than a lot of matrix centers. I would say we're semi-independent, but it's somewhere in between matrix and freestanding, probably a little closer to matrix, but it is an N of one type of situation. And I think that gets a little confusing for NCI reviewers too, because they often have the same question, what are we? I guess the best answer is close to matrix would be the answer.
But you're taking care of the cancer business of the entire Temple system.
We do. In fact, the medical oncologists on Broad Street, the downtown campus, are Fox Chase people now. And the radiation oncology is now, the head of radiation oncology is through Fox Chase, even though we have people down at the Temple Hospital. So there's integration through a lot of the system. We still, integration is a never-ending process when you have two big systems like, Fox Chase and Temple. And we meet and talk about this a lot with the dean of the medical school and the head of the health system, et cetera. We're about 60% to integration right now. There's still places that are being worked on and some that are completely integrated. So I think that's going to be a work in progress for another 10 years, but we're certainly far beyond what we were in the first couple of years when we got together. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And, another difference is really just attitude. I think we've learned to trust equivalents downtown and vice versa. So I work very closely with the dean of the medical school. I'm actually in part of the deanship structure myself. I'm an associate dean for cancer research at Temple, which is kind of a new thing. So I have a formal role in their education system. And people, as I mentioned before, there's several people who are Temple-based cancer researchers who have key roles in the cancer center. So that's more matrix-like, I would say, in that setting, and does show authentic integration, in my opinion.
Are they? I think there's recruitment ongoing for the next medical school dean at Temple.
That's true. I mean, the dean now is interim. I don't know whether she will remain dean or whether it'll be a different person. I think there is a search going on. I believe she is a candidate for it as well as an internal candidate. So we'll have to see. I mean, I don't have direct control of that process. I'm not part of the search, but I will be curious and interested in how it turns out.
Yeah, well, what do you expect from that dean, the next one, whoever that will be?
Well, I think, I would hope for continuation of the good things that were happening. So this began with John Daly, who was the dean before, who unfortunately died about a year ago. He was really pushing for integration, and he and I were working together on a master plan for how to get this done. And unfortunately, he passed away, rather unexpectedly and suddenly. But Amy Goldberg, who stepped into that job, is a Temple veteran and has been all for continuing and expanding the plans that John Daly had begun with me. And so, we appointed a new internal advisory board that had kind of gone by the wayside in the last few years, but the internal advisory board is a key element in getting sort of all these campuses in sync. And remember here, or maybe you don't know, there's 3 campuses because Temple itself has an undergraduate campus, which is closer to central Philadelphia, the med school campus, which is about 1.5 miles north of that, and then us, which are about 6 miles from there. So there's these 3 elements, all very important, that all need to work, at least in some degree of synchrony. And Amy Goldberg, the current interim dean at the medical school, has been very good about sort of negotiating those relationships.
Is there a need actually for, maybe I'm just getting too far into too deep into the weeds, but is there a need for a president and CEO at Fox Chase, or could this be a better job for the next dean, perhaps?
Oh, I don't think the dean could do that. Running the hospital is a very specific type of job that generally would be outside of most deans' purview, I would say. I mean, the deanship to me is more of an educational mission, and this is a business. And that's one of the reasons we split the job here, as we were talking about before, is that I'm not a business guy. Now, Rob Uzo is a surgeon, but he actually has an MBA as well, and is far better equipped to deal with that part of the system than I am. I'm not sure the dean of the medical school could or would want to do that. I mean, whether we need a separate CEO is sort of a different question. I think you do need somebody here who can run operations. And we are a corporation, so we're a sub corporation under the health system at Temple. So I think probably part of the corporate rules is you have a CEO whenever you have a corporation, if I understand them correctly. So they might, to do what you're musing about here, would probably require a change in our corporate structure, which again could be done, but that's something at the level of the board of directors. It's not something that I could speculate, but I can't do anything about it.
Well, there's just many ways to structure a cancer center, and that's why I was asking, because this is kind of unique and based in the history of the place. So that's
it is, and that comes up time and again here, because we do have such a deep and rich history, and Temple has a deep and rich history too. And to get the system to work requires some new thinking. And I wouldn't necessarily oppose not having a CEO here. I just think there's a lot to that. It wouldn't be trivial to just say, okay, we're going to do that and then execute it. There might be some advantages. I think there are reasons to have a local person here, but it's something that could be discussed for sure.
As you recruit new faculty now, what's your main selling point?
I go back to the basics here. This is a place you can really get your work done. We're not a teaching institution up here at Fox Chase, so some of the folks who came here, at least to the old Fox Chase, came here explicitly because they didn't want to teach. They wanted to just do their research. That was certainly true for me. Now, over time, I and many of my colleagues did sort of get the Jones for doing some teaching, and we had this unique setup where we were getting graduate students from not only all over the city. I've had Penn graduate students, I've had Temple, I've had Drexel. We were getting them from Russia. We still have a big program with Russian medical schools. Now it's a little bit on hiatus due to recent events, but we've had probably over 100 students from Russia here over the last 25 years that have done their PhD work here. So we've had, for those who want to teach, it's certainly possible. And so when I'm dealing with recruits, say, look, you can do it whatever way you want. If you want to focus on your lab, you're not going to get punished. We're not giving you a big teaching load to do. However, if you come to the point where you would like to have graduate students, you have ample opportunity to do so. So they have kind of the best of both worlds. They can pick and choose if they want to get involved with that part of the academic life. And some choose just to do their research, and that's fine too. The other thing is, we call it like the special sauce of Fox Chase, and it gets back to the kind of the history. I don't want to over romanticize the old era, and people come and go. There's been great people at other institutions too, but there is kind of a special atmosphere here, and it's almost palpable. And people come through and they say, this place, it's really unusual. And I know that was, for me, when I came, Fox Chase wasn't even on my radar. I mean, I knew it was a good place, but I was at Harvard and I had an offer to stay there, and frankly, was planning on staying there. And then I came down here and wow, I think I may have written about this in that article about the murderer's row. It's Al Knudsen, the guy, the tumor suppressor 2-hit theory guy. He's carrying my bags and he's in this little basement office, and so this is kind of weird. At Harvard, he would have been, in the penthouse suite or something. I don't mean to speak ill of Harvard, they're a great institution too, and I learned plenty there. But it was just different, and I really liked it. I liked the fact that people were not so egotistical, and yet their accomplishments, merited being egotistical. It was just a cast of unbelievably brilliant characters, and I just felt really alive when I got here. And I think others, without me even telling them anything about the place, noticed that too. And people have tried to capture it in a name. They call it Fox Chaseness. I love that name, but I'm not sure what to call it. But it is a kind of a special atmosphere that remains intact even now through all the stuff that we've been through, that ends up being our chief asset in recruiting. And it's really as simple as that, because we don't offer people generally more money. I mean, our packages are competitive, and they may be better now because we have good resources, but traditionally we don't, give better offers than our competitors. It's unlike Texas, let's say, where you have the secret program that can really make enormous packages. And, facilities are great here, but they're not greater than other places. It had to be something else. And it's usually that kind of indefinable or ineffable quality that comes from the past scientist and remains here that is my chief recruiting tool.
So this is like, to quote Joe Simone, if when you've seen one cancer center, you've seen one cancer center. This is even more singular.
It's definitely an N of one, and both good and bad, but mostly good. And look, I've had lots of opportunities to leave this place over the years. I mean, anybody who does well generally gets, attempts to recruit them. And I've looked, but I've really never found anything that would be better than what I have. And that was prior to getting, this particular job. And I think a lot of people feel the same way. Remarkably, during all of these difficulties with, getting sold and then getting unsold and all of that, we actually had very little attrition, remarkably low attrition. I think most people who are here want to stay here. Of course, they want the institution to succeed. If we were failing, people would leave. But we've managed to keep the crew mostly intact through thick and thin.
Even now with this no-cost extension, everybody's still...
Yeah, I think people share my confidence. This is a temporary aberration. It's not something we love. I'm not going to pretend that, I planned it out this way and we purposely got a no-cost extension to spur everyone to higher efforts. It's not, that would be a great story, but it's not true. But I think almost all of us looking at this have come to a similar conclusion. This is doable. we can get through this and actually come out thriving on the other side. Again, I would not have taken the job otherwise, because, you know, at my age, this is probably the last big job I'm going to have, and I'm not going out as failure. And I wouldn't have set myself up for that. So I think if people can just get past, you know, what happened and what's been written in the papers, and once we get our renewal, this thing will basically be forgotten. And 10 years from now, say, oh yeah, there was this troubled period. Well, you know, Fox Chase almost went under 4 times in its history. You know, not just this, but in the more distant past, you know, financially, it was always vulnerable. As a small freestanding center, we only were as good as the receipts of cash from that year. I mean, you know, how grants and how clinical margin or philanthropy was doing. And there were times when it very nearly went under in the past, but you don't think of it much now, because once you get through that, you know, you just focus on what's working. And I think the difference now is this stability period is likely to last for a long, long time. I mean, the hospital is just doing phenomenally well. So clinical margin is great. Grant support needs to be better, but it's not a disaster by any means. And philanthropy is sort of steady. We don't have as much commercial revenue as we probably should for an institution this size, but we'll work on that. But as I said somewhere in the earlier, I think the financial stability here now is better than it's been probably in the history of the institution. So that gives people some confidence that you'll come in and, you know, you'll still have a job. And there was a time when I couldn't say that during the worst of the period.
Yeah, it's, you know, to quote Joe Simone again, leadership matters, and you're obviously providing the leadership.
Well, I'm doing the best I can. We'll see. I mean, I'm pretty new in the job still, so my approval ratings are pretty high. But you know, the longer you stay in them, you start making decisions that inevitably, you know, disturb certain people. So as I tell most folks, I don't want to descend into Nixon territory where only, you know, 10% of the people are defending me. But I also don't want to be at 100% or close to that, because it means you're not making any hard decisions at all. So, you know, so far so good.
Yeah, and is there anything we forgot to ask? Anything we forgot to mention?
Oh, I think we've covered a lot of territory. You know, keep your eye on this place. I think this is going to be an evolving story. So don't forget about us. It's I think it's going to be a happy story, and maybe when we get our renewal, we can do another interview about how we righted the ship here. But you know, I think there's a lot that, well, the end of one, but there's still a lot that can be learned, you know, from the situation. That, you know, these downturns, and I think we've had a more severe one than most centers ever experienced, since most places don't come close to bankruptcy as we did. You know, how you can survive that and actually thrive might be an interesting tale in itself when it's finished.
Oh, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for talking with me.